if they'll engage, even if just one, it's all fine. You don't get engagement, kill it with fire. Sure. Why would you engage otherwise? Yeah. I think to that. Somebody really comes up with good, you know. All right, let me get all the sensitive stuff off the screen. Right. Oh, I live in such a blessed state. Sure, let's go. Kill all the S. Thank you. Hi, Roy.
Did you hear? Hi, Roy. Okay. Yep.
Roy, just testing things out.
We lost. Did we lose the? Oh, you did that. Oh. We lost right. We need a note.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTTP. Your working group meeting will start shortly. It's a thin crowd late in the week. How's this, Barry?
Roy's coming back.
Really now. Right?
Hey. Okay, so
We can
the
hear.
delay is about 20 seconds. Great.
Cool. You're taking delay. Okay, cool. Roy, you're a little on the loud side, just so you know. I mean, specifically now, not in general. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. It is a very thin crowd today, which maybe will make it productive. We'll see. This is HTTP. This is the Note Well. If you're not familiar with it, please search for it on your favorite search engine on the internet. It is the terms under which we participate regarding things like intellectual property and especially behavior. So please do be aware of it if you aren't already. We do take it seriously, especially the behavior part. Do we have someone willing to volunteer to be a scribe? If you're thinking about it, the prizes await. You wouldn't believe how wonderful it is. Craig.
Notes.
He timed that wrong. If you could take notes in the media of your choice, we do have an Etherpad in the agenda, but if you wish to use something like large company here docs, please go ahead and just share the link with folks on the Jabber channel. The blue sheets are circulating? Yes? Good. Maybe we should have only used one with a crowd this size. And can someone volunteer to relay comments from Jabber? Because we do have some remote participants. That you can do. Thank you very much. The agenda today, we've done a little bit of bashing pre-meeting. There's been some discussion for a while in the quick working group, which has come here from time to time, about priorities. And folks really want to figure out what the path forward is for priorities or hints for client to server priorities in HTTP 3. And so we're going to bring the discussion here so that this group can give its input, because as we know, this group owns the future of HTTP and especially HTTP 3. And so the quick folks didn't want to make a decision about that without getting some consensus here. So we're going to talk about that, hopefully for about 15 minutes. We don't want to take too much time. Then we have a quick presentation on HTTP HBS SVC, which I see I forgot an S, and hopefully that'll be relatively brief. Then we'll go through the core issues as much as we can. Time permitting, we have a presentation on braid. Any bashing of the agenda? Okay. So let's start off with a discussion of HTTP priorities. And I'm looking around because I'm looking for the people who are trying to drive that discussion. I don't see many in the room. Lucas, I don't see Ian, I don't see Martin. Should we punt for a little while and see if we can? Yeah, let's go ahead and have the HTTPS SVC discussion and see if a few more people come in from the wonderland of cookies and brownies. 1 second. Yeah, there are conflicts now. Okay, so let's do this presentation. Eric, take it away.
So I'll be finding the right direction. Is this too loud? Maybe?
That's fine.
Okay. Eric Niagara and Akamai, I'm going to be talking about a HTTPS SVC DNS record type, which hopefully this will probably not be the actual end name of the record. If only given the sheer number of typos we've seen, including my own, on how many S's it has. Next slide. So the motivation for this has come out of trying to solve a bunch of problems holistically that have each been popping up in various places independently of each other. There's been kind of a long-standing kind of issue or question is, hey, wouldn't it be great if there was something that was SRV-like or HTTP record-like or similar that HTTP clients would use? But as a number of things, as HTTP3 is coming into play, and as encrypted SNI is coming into play, and as people on the DNS side are getting more and more frustrated about the zone apex problem, there's starting to build a critical mass of pressure to actually try to solve this problem. So this record is trying to look at how do we solve a number of these problems in a holistic manner, and rather than going and introducing a bunch of new records, having kind of one well-structured thing we've thought through and designed through that could solve it. Next slide. So the idea would be to have a single new records that clients could resolve in parallel with A and quad A lookups. Note this is client-specific, not browser-specific, despite what my typo on the first version of the slide I had. Trying to design something that's usable and fits well into the way that people configure HTTP available services, having it be extensible enough so that when we come up with the next sort of use case we want to solve, it doesn't become oh no, but now we need to get clients to go and do yet another lookup, but it's something that we can extend onto this. And also something that's compelling enough and solves enough of the problems that we can convince clients to actually go and implement it, as well as looking at this as are there opportunities here to move to more secure defaults? For example, now that as the world has gone from being mostly HTTP to mostly HTTPS, has seen, at least from the perspective of a browser perspective, are there some things we can do to kind of use this to signal and switch some of the defaults so that clients don't have to go and make a round trip through clear text HTTP to get upgraded to HTTPS. Next slide. So the general approach here ends up looking very similar to SRV, if you're familiar with SRV, but with the ability to add more extensibility onto it. So for example, being able to, for host names such as www.example.com, say that there may be two different services that can implement this for you. One of them is at service domain name 1 and has this set of IPs and this port and implements HTTP3 and has this encrypted SNI key, and this other instantiation or implementation of the service might have a different domain name, a different set of ports, a different set of application protocol calls, and a different ESNI key. Next slide. There are two forms of this, one of which is a alias form that's really meant to delegate over authority. Its primary purpose is to solve this zone apex problem of the fact that for a hostname like example.com, you can't put a CNAME. Note that the intent, kind of a compromise here, is that for there are two places you can have the HTTPS service record. One of which is for things that are standard HTTPS 443 URIs. You can just put it on example.com. Whereas to support alternate ports or alternate schemes, you can use the label form. Next slide.
Sorry, when you say alternate schemes, do you mean anything except HTTP and HTTPS?
Yeah, which we have not defined yet for alternative service. But if we were to define something other than HTTP or HTTPS that we wanted to do alternate service with,
okay, you
could use that form. Trying to think ahead a little bit, but and then the second form is an alternative, is the alternative services form, and this you can kind of is the one that looks much closer to a like SRV that's extensible. So in this, you have there's a priority. The priority is there because there is no within R sets you don't have an ordering. So if you want to have explicit ordering, you need to have a priority to specify what that ordering is like. And then the rest of it is actually taking the alternate services concept that we've defined for HTTP and having a way to have that in DNS. There's from the perspective of, or from feedback we had in DNS op, we pulled the host name out of the alt service and actually had it separate field, because that makes it easier for DNS recursors to parse that and attach it into additional sections than if they have to go parse up the alt service string. But then after that is the extensible key equals value alt service format. Within the context of the draft, the current draft defines a ESNI keys alt service parameter extension. That might be something that actually wants to be split off to accept its own draft, but at least for now, it's for simplicity, it's just incorporated directly here. The next slide. So some of the major feedback we've gotten on this so far, we've brought this to DNS op and the TLS working group and have had a bunch of hallway conversations, is how much to generalize this. I think there's interest in having it more general than just HTTPS. So for example, at least generalizing it to be kind of an alt service level of generalization. I think there's a question of, does generalizing it much beyond that start opening up the Pandora's box of overgeneralization, go create your own working group, spend years on it, and have something no one uses. But I think there's hopefully some balance in between. Another question that's come up a bunch is whether to allow inlining of the address records within this. There are pros and cons and issues with doing that. Another one is whether to allow external references to named keys. Like for the ESNI keys, you may have a number of different records here that all have the same key, and having to have that same value over and over again starts getting fairly big. But at the same time, there's performance that impacts if you don't have it in cache, you have to go fetch it again. There's I think the impact on client complexity, especially for non-browser clients, is one that's come up as a concern, because it may be that as the world is getting more and more, as we start having HTTP2 and HTTP3 and various happy eyeballs implementations and all and ESNI keys and all the TLS stuff you want to do, that clients will end up using more and more a library that encapsulates a lot of that, which is a place you could put this. But it does mean that trying to take advantage or trying to leverage this from a client you write from scratch that's not using a library this is yet another hurdle that things might need to jump over. And another thing we've gotten from some client implementers is whether they would, whether in their implementations they would require the use of DO or DNSSEC, if only as both from what is kind of the risk exposure of having this unauthenticated, but also from how much does doing yet another record lookup through poorly implemented home router resolvers cause problems. Next slide. I think the other question here is, what do we call the record? I think this is kind of a bike shed topic. I was almost tempted to call this a bike shed record, but then it was pointed. What? B is the winner. I kind of like B. The next slide. So in terms of next steps here, we presented this to DNSOP. There was interest there, actually interest to the degree that both Bind9 did an implementation before I'd even presented here, and then someone from Unbound did an implementation during the hackathon. There haven't yet been any client-side implementations. I think there's a question and a discussion between there was going to be a discussion between the DNSOP chairs and the HTTP chairs as to which working group makes more sense. I think the degree to which we generalize that will make an impact on this. Like if given some of the, maybe we should generalize this feedback, it may end up being that pushing the DNS direction makes sense with close consultation here. We gave some visibility to TLS working group because I think it would be very nice to not have to have a special ESNI record that contains IP addresses and other stuff and a special purpose for that. But at the same time, I think the folks in TLS would rather not have to go wait for a few years for something like this to materialize before they can deploy ESNI. So that's it.
Okay. So this is interesting because this is not the first time we've talked about this by far.
Yes, in some ways this is a renaming of.
And I think you've given a number of those. I think Hawaii, we talked about it, and yeah.
I think in Hawaii it may have been called B, and then Mike had one that was called had a alt service, or Mike or Ben had the alt service one that a lot of this is derived from. But each one of these variations of this is taking a lot of the feedback and refining it to try to kind of address the issues that came up previously. Yeah,
and previously, a lot of the concerns that I heard, or that I remember at least, were around authentication and integrity of the information, and also concerns around clients making a lot of parallel requests and how difficult that can be. Now with DOE and with the increased deployment of DNSSEC, that's maybe a changed situation.
Right, that was a changed situation. I think it's also the ESNI keys one is one that's pushed it, because at some point that is forcing clients to make another request. So I think that was the thing for me that said, okay, if we're gonna have to do that extra request there, can we solve a bunch of these other problems that we've been saying, hey, it would be nice if we could get clients to do another extra request, but then look at how do we do that right so we don't have to have the same conversation over and over.
It's a good opportunity, yeah. And so before I give the mics, the thing I'm looking for personally is client implementer interest, because that's what's always stopped us before.
Ben Schwartz, I just want to, on the topic of authentication, I wanted to point out that this draft is intended to be used and fully usable unauthenticated. And to some extent, I think that previous concerns about authentication of this kind of information, I think, have decreased because the TLS working group has had to think through very carefully the consequences of distributing ESNI unauthenticated and confirmed that that was safe.
So that seems like it might have implications on other discussions we're having as well. Interesting.
So I have two comments. One, chair hat completely off. As a client implementer, I think we are interested in taking advantage of something that looks like this and see how it develops. So I think there's interest there. But then as with chair hat on, I did have a discussion with Benno, who's one of the DNS op chairs earlier. So just for this room, I think his sense of their room is that they are very interested in doing this work and moving that work there. So if people in this room have issues with that or would like to see it, be here instead of there, it'd be good to hear that. I imagine we'd still want to get updates on the progress of this work either way.
Just a question, would we want to maybe last call in both groups? Or? Is that too
I
much?
think
Too
it
much
depends on
process?
how general it is.
Yeah.
If they remove all the HTTP specific bits, then maybe not.
Fair call.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, again, as a client implementer, we've had some discussions about this and are reasonably enthusiastic about something that might stand in for ES&I that is a little less janky than the current record format. Certainly having the enthusiasm of the DNS community, or at least people who know what they're doing, makes us a little happier about this sort of thing. And if we're going to be making extra queries for different record types, it may as well be a good one. So tentatively positive on this one, I think that's what we'd say.
I agree. Let's say it's good.
Yeah.
So
Right,
I'm not that familiar with ES&I, but my understanding is that ES&I itself depends on a separate DNS request. Is there a way to piggyback this response on that?
I think that would be subsumed by this.
Yeah, I think-
Yes.
Yeah, I think the intent was that this would subsume the need to have a dedicated request for ES&I.
So, Mike Bishop, I will make the comment on, in terms of which working group it lives in, DNSOP already did something like this, and it was called SRV, and nobody in the HTTP has touched it. So no matter where it lives, we have to have buy-in from this working group and from the implementers here, or we just shouldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care who works on it. We should all work on it. But the interest has to be here.
Mm-hmm. And one possibility, and some of this depends on what is the right factoring in terms of how general, could be a kind of the general purpose draft that describes how to use it, and then a that's in DNSOP, and then a specific here's how to use this for HTTPS that covers some of the HTTPS specific things, like how does this work in the case of proxies and other things that might live here.
A potentially interesting complexity here is what happens when you're using DOE and maybe another DNS server simultaneously. The great thing about DOE is, like the rest of HTTP, it can be per session, but the other DNS servers may be different, and so you can end up with weird bounces. I think you have to resolve that one way or another, and it would be really weird. Oh, and Roberto Peon, sorry.
So from my perspective, sorry, you have Vice Google. From my perspective, on the one hand, it's exciting to see negotiation moving to the DNS layer, and I was initially excited to try this out as part of client hints and try to move that part of content negotiation to the DNS layer. I also this week got the feedback that runs a risk of bloating those records, and people weren't super excited about that. So generally, I would love to see some solution that resolves the early content negotiation problem while not introducing that bloat to DNS. Maybe it can be in collaboration with this and other layers, or
Yeah, Martin Thompson. I want a pony too. Unfortunately, if you want some sort of bootstrapping here, you're going to have to pay some price. We've found that particularly with things like DOE, the additional cost is relatively modest in terms of performance. The ES&I records still fit in a packet, basically. They wouldn't fit in the typical UDP packet quite so much, but that's probably just reflecting my misunderstanding of how the DNS over UDP works. But I think this is really kind of valuable. I think this is more valuable as this is a TLS record, and you have in that TLS record, you say, here's where you go to connect to them, here's maybe the port number. I don't know whether the port number makes any sense in this context. And here's all the bootstrapping information you need for ES&I. And I'm almost of the opinion that if this doesn't always include ESNI, it's not really doing us very much good. I would like to have this always be ESNI.
Ben,
But that's just me.
sorry. Ben, I'd mentally inserted myself in the queue if you don't terribly mind. I'm lazy. Personally, no hats. I think, and the reason why I wanted to follow Martin was that there's a little bit of tension there in that some people are seeing this as a generic TLS mechanism. I see it more as a generic mechanism that it has a lot of benefits if it's aligned with alt services, which means it's HTTP specific, potentially. And I think we'd lose something if that were taken out. So that's something that we probably need to think through and come to agreement on.
Ben Schwartz. In particular, I know there are people in this room who are not paying very close attention, who would really like this as a mechanism to bootstrap quick instead of having to start over TCP, and that clearly is not at the TLS layer.
Speaking for Roy Fielding, I think that combining ESNI for privacy and alt service for extensibility is the first time that makes service records worth implementing for HTTP.
Thank you. So I think we'll have a discussion with the DNS Hub chairs and the authors, and expect some motion on this.
Yeah.
It seems like a pause. I don't think we need a hum or anything. So that's good. Thank you. So let's return to our previously scheduled discussion on priorities. So there's been a discussion in the Quick Working Group about priorities, and I think there are several proposals floating around. But the point we came to was that the decision about the future of priorities needs to come mostly from this community, since the charter of Quick is to reflect the semantics of HTTP2, and that lives firmly here. And so the question is, there's a lot of backstory here. We're not going to go over it now because I think most people are familiar with it. There is a lot of doubt about the utility of priorities in HTTP2, let alone HTTP3. There are a lot of Quick implementers who don't want to include HTTP2 priorities in HTTP3 at all. And so as a community here, they'd like our advice as to whether we want to hold them to that bar of including HTTP2 priorities in HTTP3. And so that's in some ways a yes or no question. There are a lot of other questions to ask and a lot of different ways to get to a place where we have better priorities in HTTP. And by the way, every time I say priorities, what I really mean is client to server hints about priority when they're sending responses, because that seems to be continually a fact that's forgotten in these discussions. It's a horrible name. So, cue the mics. Let's figure this out. Can we prioritize? Never mind.
Okay. Ben Schwartz. I have no knowledge on this. I shouldn't be wasting your time. But I just but I just want to point out that the order of arrival of requests from the client is something like an indication of priorities. At least it's correlated.
So Martin and I have very recently submitted a little draft that goes something like, sure. An important feature of any implementation of a protocol, I'm going to speak like Ecker, provides multiplexing, is the ability to prioritize the sending of information. We realized this was important when we did HTTP2. Prioritization is...
Roberto, sorry, can you please slow down? I can't understand you.
Sorry, I was trying to go slower. Anyway, okay. Prioritization is difficult and arguably incomplete. So it will always be suboptimal, particularly if one endpoint operates in ignorance of the needs of its peer. HTTP2 introduced a complex prioritization signaling scheme that used a combination of dependencies and weights, formed into an unbalanced tree That scheme also depends on in-order delivery, so it is unsuitable for use in protocols like HTTP3, which attempt to avoid global ordering. Furthermore, though that scheme was rich in some ways, it has proven to be inadequate in several others. It is not well suited to major use cases like live video delivery, and it cannot be used to carry hints from servers. This prioritization scheme also suffered from poor deployment and interop. Most server implementations do not include support for the scheme. Unfortunately, I know somebody who actually did all of it, and he's awesome, by the way, Alan. Some favoring bespoke schemes instead, based on heuristics and other hints, like the content type and the order in which the requests arrive. Consequently, the priority hints defined in HTTP2 can't be used across different HTTP versions. So we must either define more rich schemes that might support translation between versions, or we will suffer information loss if multiple versions are in use. Retaining the H2 priority scheme increases the complexity of the entire system, and we don't have evidence that this complexity is offset by any value. And then we have a little draft here that says we should, deprecate them, and basically that servers shouldn't necessarily respond to them after we submit this, and that clients shouldn't send them. And we also need something better, probably, but hey.
Sure. So to be clear, you're proposing that we deprecate HTTP priorities full stop in 2 and never put them in 3.
I am suggesting we deprecate H2 priorities.
That's
My
what I just
personal
said.
preference is that we have HTTP priorities, which H2 priorities cannot be.
Right. So, but that hasn't been created yet, though. Right. Okay.
So Martin Thompson, this is the essence of the discussion we're having. I don't think many people are particularly attached to the HTTP2 scheme, which is part of the reason we put this in place. And copying something we know is, for want of a better word, bad, into a new protocol would be irresponsible. The challenge is working out how we get from where we are today to where we want to be. And the proposal that Roberto and I are basically saying here is that we first revert to the null state, and then we work out how we get to the happy state. There's a lot of disagreement about what the happy state looks like right now.
Right.
And I don't think we're going to get to any place within the sort of timeframes that we've told the IESG we would finish quick, without incredible effort. Now, if that happens, and I will help drive that, but I don't think we're going to succeed. But I will, if that happens, we can put that priority scheme into both HTTP2 and HTTP3 and sing a little happy dance and celebrate victory. But I think we're looking at shipping quick within sort of 6 months-ish. And 6 months is, in my experience, not enough time to decide on the color of wallpaper, let alone something as complex as a prioritization scheme.
So Martin, before you leave the mic, I just want to clarify, by deprecating this, you have some influence over the behavior of a web browser. If this is the consensus of the group, is your intention that your browser will stop emitting priorities in your requests?
Yeah. This is not something that we've discussed internally. But
I'm not asking for commitment. I'm just saying
this is
what's your intent?
my personal position on this would be, if the community decides that we're going to just abandon this scheme, and we're going to go searching for another one, we will join that community and abandon this scheme and go searching for another one. And that means potentially doing things like experimenting. We have a team that is dedicated to looking at performance of page loading, and they've done some really deep analysis on what needs to happen. And they're just now looking at how they might signal that. And so we're at a point where we do have the opportunity to run those sorts of experiments. Right. So I think we're pretty well positioned to participate in this effort if people are interested in doing it. So
there's a difference between deprecating them on paper and deprecating them in the implementations.
Right.
And it can get messy.
No, I wanted to make clear that we're also behind the plan of whatever we decide to do here.
Okay, thank you.
Mike Bishop. So in the side meeting, we discussed a couple of different paths from where we are to happy state. One possibility was having an extension that let you negotiate potentially multiple priority schemes, but at the minimum we will have nothing, H2, and whatever we come up with, probably some other experiments on the way. And of course, the problem with having a flexible negotiation scheme like that is that you could have total mismatch between what the client and server support. And there was a lot of concern about going there potentially. But what I think there was general agreement on is following on from that draft, having an extension in H2 to say, hey, I don't support priorities, don't bother sending them to me. Or conversely, I, as the client, am not going to send you priorities. That is not a request for equally weighted. That is a use your best judgment. So I think probably the first step for this working group is adopting an extension of that sort, potentially in parallel with saying we've deprecated this, and this setting indicates that you're a client aware of that deprecation. And then in the H3, that would just be the normal state, and we could rip it out of H3 entirely. Or maybe there's a reverse to say, hey, I actually do support this if you need to translate H2 priorities onto the connection. That's a judgment that can wait. But I think right now we need to talk about what are we doing for H2 and what would our experimentation framework look like.
So if I could try and characterize, just to make sure I understand, you would like to have a replacement before we would consider deprecating anything.
That's not what I said.
Okay. Then
I would like to have a way to express that the client is not participating in the priority scheme.
Okay.
And I would like to understand how we plan to experiment. That doesn't mean we have to have the experiments done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
So Rory's going to
Yeah, let's have Rory next.
I was going to say, if we can agree that it's sufficient for priorities to be communicated via a header field in the requests and header field in the responses, then I think we can take the whole subject out of the critical path for query, in the sense that it then becomes just another header field that's communicated.
Patrick. So I agree with many of the points Roberto made, but I think I wanted to push against one that says that client side priority indications have not shown any value. And the case that came immediately to mind was very easy because Ben spoke right before him and suggested that we revert to the signaling of the request ordering as a substitute for client-side indications. And as we struggled with for years, that of course creates this sort of paradox on the client about whether it should issue a request now or whether it should wait in order to determine what might want to go before this request, right? And it creates idle time on the wire and idle responses. If you do it in one direction, and if you do it in the more aggressive direction, it results in your higher priority content getting pushed out by other things. And I think we learned that as a key objective. Now, the H2 priority scheme is too general. I don't know if it's too complicated, but it's definitely too general. You don't get any consistency between implementations when using it. And no one wants to implement it going forward. And we would be foolish to ignore those statements. So I think we need to sort of take that as a given with regards to the H2. And the answer is we have to find something different, which kind of leaves us in the pool of, do we have something different or do we want to go like with nothing? And I think my argument is, rather than say nothing, perhaps we could agree on something very minimal while we work on what it is we really do want to ship. I was a little surprised to hear from Martin that he felt there was a lot of contention around sort of what the happy state was, because my impression was that it had kind of been merging towards consensus among the people most involved in that direction. So that's certainly interesting input. I'm wondering if we could get consensus on something that we knew was minimal, that in a similar way do we want to replace nothing with the happy state, we would be interested in replacing minimal with the happy state. And there are lots of minimal solutions that have been used in many, many domains. nice simple rank schemes, those kinds of things. Not overspecify the semantics of them, but, back to the, 3 bits, 5 bits of, strictly ranked levels. And that may satisfy our requirement for solving these basic use cases that we know we did solve the first time around without backing off for this period. So I would like to suggest to see if we can coalesce an idea like that and make that a required part of shipping quick, because it should be simple, easy, and small, even if we know it's not like fully expressive. And then in parallel work on the happy state, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, you have Vice Google. So a couple of points. One, Mike suggested that there's a lot of fear from client-server negotiation of the right scheme, which will result in a mismatch. The result of a mismatch is there is no agreed-on priority scheme, which is effectively the current status quo. And regarding request ordering, we have a bug in Chrome that preload requests go out before other low priority preload requests go out before high priority, for example, CSS requests, but like 2 milliseconds before them, just because of a bug. That effectively results in those low priority images arriving to the client before the CSS because they went out 2 milliseconds earlier. That is the state of current H2 priority implementations. So a request order-based priority scheme is not going to be significantly different than what we see today for many of the implementations, not all of them. Some of them are perfect, but most of them are not. So I would think, like, on top of that, I heard from multiple people that the proposed priority schemes are great for websites, but there are other use cases that also matter. So maybe instead of trying to fit all the use cases into a single priority scheme that does everything, we can have different priority schemes that implement different things that are more adapted to video or games or websites. And then the client and the server can choose. And if there is no agreement, we fall back to the status quo today, basically.
So I just want to, we have a very deep queue, so we need to make it brief. But I want to remind people that the big question here is, what do we want to tell quick about HTTP3? There are many different ways we can get to fixing priorities. We'd spend way more than time we have today trying to fix that. So we need to focus on what we're going to tell HTTP3.
So I would say an extension mechanism that enables content like client-server negotiation, and then figure out the rest later.
But let them ship without H2 priorities?
Yes.
Okay.
Alessandro Ghedini, Cloudflare. So to answer Mark's question, I think that at this point, removing priorities from HTTP3 seems like the most viable way forward. I don't think people are going to implement the current scheme going forward for HTTP3. But following what Patrick said, however flawed the H2 priorities are right now, they do provide some value. So I would be wary of just not doing them at all. This said, we would be very interested in experimenting with new schemes with whatever client wants to do it with us. So being other, like there's Kazua's draft or other proposals. So.
Kazuhoku, firstly, speaking as a developer, as a personal opinion, I think that it would be fine for the browsers to stop sending priority frames, because we could have backup plans using content types and server-driven hints. On the other hand, what I would really like to see is new clients or existing clients are starting using the priority frames of HTTP2 in a new way. Because, I mean, today we can switch our prioritization scheme from HTTP2 based approach to a new absolute value based like 3-bit or 5-bit. thing. And then we can create a translation table from the HTTP2's priorities that either Chrome or Firefox sends to those 3 or 5 bits. And it will work fine. And assuming that would also become the norm for HTTP3, we can simply have a single prioritization scheme on the server side, regardless of whether if the browser sends the priority frames. But that only works if the browsers stop doing new things with the priority frames of HTTP2, because we need to have a stable mapping.
Alan Frindo, Facebook. Okay. So I agree that H2 priorities are broken, and it's okay to not copy them forward into HTTP3. Like, we should let them go. I think the idea of having a setting that indicates that we're, like Lucas and Brad put out to the list, like a setting in H2 that says, yes, I am going to send H2 priority, or no, I am not going to support priority. I think that's probably a good thing. I'm really worried about removing priorities entirely from each, or I should say a client sent priority hinting scheme from H3. Particularly if we take it out of the critical path of shipping HTTP3, then it will sort of remove the urgency to have this scheme developed, and it will languish much longer. And if we go to a state like Martin is suggesting, where the browser stops sending any priority whatsoever, and we ship H3 and there's no priority, then we're going to be in a bad state for a long time. So I think there's value in having this client send hinting, and one of the reasons is that we don't currently implement like a server-side content type based, and the word in the side meeting used was fragile scheme for the server to come up with its own priority. And I would rather not go there or force every server developer to go there.
Ian Sweat, Google. I definitely obviously support removing the existing HTTP3 priorities from quick. In terms of moving forward, I also intend to spend a fair amount of time and also development work actually running some different experiments and trying to figure out what to do. But I think, honestly, I expect we're going to end up we Chrome are going to end up for our implementation, and our servers are going to end up using something very similar to Kazuo's proposal, though probably not in a header. Instead, probably smuggled in the existing H2 priority frame, because we already have an int there. We can just cram it in. And that works fine for HTTP2 as well as quick. But we do need a setting to negotiate something. But I guess this is kind of channeling Patrick's comment, which is, I don't think we're that far off something we think is maybe not perfect, because there is no such thing as perfect, but pretty damn good. I have a slight preference for binary encoding over headers, but that's just me.
Hi, Lucas Pardee, Cloudflare. Just to say that, yeah, Alan mentioned it. Brad and I pushed a very short draft earlier today, just to give an example of how you might write this extension to advertise that you don't want to use priority. And if you happen to send priority frames, after doing that, the other side should ignore them. It's not perfect, but it's basically the mechanism to do what we're talking about removing priorities. It doesn't articulate the problem space as well as Roberto's initiation to this session. We could probably do something about combining with them if that's the approach that we want to take. I don't know. We'll see.
A bit of a warning. Header-borne priorities have a lot of complexities. And I'm going to end this, but header-borne priorities have a lot of complexities, especially involving caching. What's the priority that you cache for a range request, or when you have multiple requesters from different applications in different locations, right? That being said, I actually support headers, and I support going down this rabbit hole, because I think that headers are, in the end, they're kind of the essence of HTTP. Right? They are HTTP everywhere. It doesn't matter how you transfer it. They are part of the semantic of HTTP. And I think one of the failings we had in H2 was that we made it really difficult or even impossible for a client to signal its needs or preferences with regards to priority. Headers being part of the semantic, being visible to all layers of the stack, are a good way to do this. And a funny thing about headers is, at least with header compression, especially when you're not using dependencies and you just have relative few priorities, it's actually more efficient on the wire. So, added benefit. So I think we should think through these complexities. I think it belongs here. This is an HTTP problem, not even a quick problem if we're going to do it in headers. And we have to be very careful about it because there are a lot of areas that we touch if we do this.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, I like some of the things in the designs that people have proposed with headers. I like the fact that you can get a proper end-to-end signal effectively and that it's available to intermediaries is a nice benefit. In both directions was also a nice benefit. Roberto's right about the caching. Of course, that's going to be a little tricky to work out, but I think we can work through that pretty effectively if we spend the time. I think that the draft that Brad and Lucas have put together, anyone else on that one, seems to be the path that Kazuo. Oh, Kazuo, Brad. Okay, good work, Brad. I think that's probably better than what Roberto and I have proposed here. I think we were simply looking to make a statement saying that these have failed and this is one way that you would go. Having an explicit signal acknowledging that you're not using these would be valuable. I'm hearing from people who operate real services though, they would be disappointed if we stop sending priority frames in the short term, at least before we have something in place. And so we probably need some transitional stuff worked out. And this is probably part of it.
Brad Bossy, Google, saying something that's probably pretty obvious, but with the setting, you could use a value other than 0 and 1 to indicate that you're reinterpreting what's in the priority frame and still use the existing priority frame.
So with my chair hat on and I'm waiting anxiously for kicks from either my left or my right, I don't think we can deprecate priorities with this much notice. I think that's off the table for today. Sorry, Martin. Sorry.
So Mark, let's be clear. I don't think we're asking for working group adoption 15 minutes after the draft was written. I've heard it's happened before, but not this time. It's input to the discussion.
Right. I am hearing. I don't think I heard any pushback against the idea of telling the quick working group, that HTTP3 does not need to convey HTTP2 priorities, and that's the high order bit here. If anyone has an issue with that, please get to the mics right now. Well, yes, there will be a discussion between the chairs of various hats and the ADs, but I think that we have a clear path forward for that question. Yeah. Alan, your statement confused me a tiny bit, so I'm glad you're at the mic.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just, I said that it was okay to let H2 priorities go from H3. If we bring something, if there's something new introduced, it'd be nice, as like Kazuho mentioned, if there's a way to translate from one to the other. But if it couldn't be done, that's okay. So what confused you?
I heard you say two slightly different things, which was it's okay to not require HTTP3 to convey HTTP2 priorities, but you expect HTTP3 to have some priority mechanism.
Yes.
Right, but that's an argument for a different working group.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm glad we have that nuance.
I tried to say it in quick, and then you cut the mic line on me.
I'm sorry, Alan. I'll buy a cocktail.
So Mark, keep in mind the responsibility for providing that priority scheme lies here.
Yes,
right.
That is to me very clear, and I want to make sure there's agreement on that. That a new priority scheme will not emerge from the quick working group; it will emerge from this working group.
Right, and I think we need to be very clear on that one, and we need to be very, very fast because essentially we're racing the quick working group if we tell them then they're not getting H2, or they're allowed to not. Do
and
H2.
This is what concerns me is we've had this discussion in the past. This is not a new topic. And the last time we exhorted client developers, search developers to work together, do experimentation, gather data, and we've made a bit of progress. We have some proposals on the table, but it'd be great if we actually saw some data and get some experimentation and experience. Yeah. A design team. Ooh.
Design team would be great. I think you're right, but I'll remind everybody that last time we went through trying to make priorities, we were also making the whole rest of it as well. I mean, yes, we had the base of some speedy deployments, but they were sufficiently different that it didn't really matter. So all I'm really trying to say is I hope that the barrier to entry for doing this experimentation is actually lower this time, so it might actually happen.
I hope so.
And thank you, Ian, for saying it's going to happen, because yay, Ian.
I'm just aware that a lot of the people involved are busy doing a couple of other small things. And
small things.
You know, this was done under pressure the last time, and we thought we had a good idea the last time. I wanted more evidence that we actually are doing something better.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson again. Unlike Ian, I don't think I can make a commitment to do something within the time frame that we're talking about, which is why I'm sort of caveating all of this. But I'm certainly willing to put the work in where possible. It's just that, yeah, some small things, small other things on the plate as well.
Who would be willing to participate in an HTTP priority revision design team? Hands up. Okay, I see Ian, Brad, Roberto. This is going to the recording worst case. I see Craig. I see Mike. Until you're done. Start today.
The race against.
So you're was asking about the parameters of the race against Quick. But
we can game that.
Well, we can make Quick as slow as we want. That's not really a goal.
Magnus isn't here.
Speaking.
Sorry. One second. We have Alan. We have Kazuho. I see Lucas. I saw Craig. I saw Ian before, and Brad, and Roberto. And you don't have your hand up. Okay, fair enough. I got you, Lucas. Yeah, I think we're good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Speaking with my editor of Quick hat on, I don't anticipate us finishing Quick before the end of the year. I know that sounds sad to people. I'm not going to say anything about what happens next year, but you may be more sad if you want to talk to me offline. That said, I expect that Quick will be stable a lot sooner than that.
Yes.
And people will be very reluctant to make changes. Even, we're moving to late stage process for all the drafts now, aren't we? I think. We didn't decide that. We should have decided that this week. But there's going to be some reluctance to put anything in implementations in a short time because people are going to be shipping this stuff.
Yeah.
And we need to be aware of that.
Right. So I want to wrap this discussion up because we're definitely over time. One more question of the people who put their hand up for the design team. Who is willing to put in the work to lead it, to crack the whip and make sure that it actually gets moving? Ian, you've got time to do that because it will take some time. Yeah. Okay. Ian, thank you very much. We'll talk about getting you the resources you need. All right.
Both Roy Fielding and Colin Bendel's hand are up on Jabber.
Sorry? We didn't hear that. What was that?
Roy and Colin.
Two more volunteers.
Roy and Colin. Okay, great. Thank you.
Did we say Ian was leading that?
Yes. Ian is leading that, yes. So if you change your mind later and decide you do want to join it, talk to Ian. It's a little bit big for a design team, to be honest, but we'll see if it's workable.
Roy says, I still expect HTTP core to finish at least a week before Quick.
Taking bets. All right. Let's go to the core specifications. The chairs do have some side bets, yes. Let's go to the issues list on the core specifications. And we are looking at the discuss label. Is that all we have left? Is it half an hour? Okay, well, let's get through them then. These are the issues that the editors thought might benefit from some working group discussion. So let's just go through them serially, I think. Some of them may be quite short. Number 218, disambiguate 403 forbidden. So Asborn asks, the interpretation of 403 forbidden is used in two situations, when the requested operation is forbidden and when the requested operation is forbidden for the user identified. So in other words, it's a bit of an authentication failure almost. And he gives us some text here. If authentication credentials were provided in the request, the server considers them insufficient to grant access. The client should not automatically repeat the request with the same credentials. The client may repeat the request with new or different credentials. And then there's a further sentence later on. However, requests might be forbidden for reasons unrelated to the credentials. And if I scroll down a little bit, I think I made a proposal. The phrase authorize it in the first sentence is the root of the issue, and 2616 used fulfill it instead. And so if we go back to that, where is that? Down here? Yep. Yeah, this bit right here. So in other words, refuse to authorize it, refuses to fulfill it would be the proposed text. And then Asborn replies with a slight modification of that, but I think it's relatively in the spirit. I wanted to bring this up just to make sure that people were okay to switch back from authorize it to fulfill it, and to prod Roy, especially in Julian, to see if there was a reason why we changed that in BIS.
Rory says +1 to fulfill.
I guess. Okay. If either of you two can remember why we did that, that would be good to know. Julian says +1 too? Okay. Martin.
So, Martin Thompson, what other things might cause something to generate a 403? Is it the phase of the moon? Or I'm asking seriously, because if the typical interpretation of a 403 is that my credentials, the credentials that I offered were insufficient,
right?
Which is which is number 2, then what's the semantics of point number 1?
Servers it might be server configuration, it might be other state that isn't about the client.
Okay.
I can answer that too. Ceph Gentle, another way that we use 403 fib in the wide world is like there's some URL prefix for which, we don't want to show you the index of a directory or something like that. A lot of servers will 403 forbidden for resources that nobody should be accessing.
Authentication information can be carried in ways other than just the standard HTTP authentication token. So for example, if somebody presents in CDN interconnect, if somebody presents a token that is invalid, we may 403 them with a reason that tells them what's wrong with their token. So it's an authorization problem for that specific user, but in a way unrelated to the specific HTTP header named authorization.
Okay. I don't want us to faceplant on this one issue. It's a pretty simple wording change. So let's not get the cue.
So I'm sorry. The reason that I asked was that I'm not sure that this really makes any difference. But I guess it's fine. We're not talking about authorization. We're talking just general. I'm deciding not to answer this request, right? That's what 403
That's
means.
the semantic of 403 is, yeah. And that's this is asking for clarity around that. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say we discussed and okay to change. Okay. Next up, 215 field value space. Anna is asking for the value space of field values. He wants us to expand the set of allowed characters because browsers allow characters other than what we allow in the ABNF. Both Julian and I on the issue say that we think that's out of scope for this effort. Just wanted to confirm that in the room. Does anyone want to disagree with that?
So again, Martin Thompson, my understanding of your response here is that there's a generic error handling section in the document that talks about how you might choose to recover from variations in inputs, and this would be covered under that in terms of this specification. Is that
That's not what I meant. That is probably true, but generally, just because some components allow a greater range of characters doesn't mean that won't break other components.
Right.
Yeah.
But
so we can't expand it.
But the browser behavior might be justified under the terms of those generic error handling and
if
recovery.
If it would like to,
text,
absolutely, yeah.
Right. But
if it thinks it can
but
recover successfully.
Yeah, you're not changing the definition of what the core protocol is as a result of the fact that some people have gone a little post-Delhi on them.
Exactly. Yeah. Any other feedback? Otherwise, I'm going to say we should close with no action. Okay. If I can spell. Next up, 212, byte range set definition allows OWS, but probably doesn't work in practice. Roy, do you want to walk us through this? I'm not familiar with this one.
Okay, I was reworking the byte range set, and I noticed that the byte ranges allows for one pound sign byte range spec. And a list of byte ranges might or might include white space in that case. I didn't think that would be interoperable, but it turns out that people actually do seem to accept this in practice. So I think we can close this as saying, yeah, they do work in practice. So basically the question is white space allowed between the commas in byte sets or not? Currently it is. Should we turn it off or should we disallow it? And my current opinion is that we should allow it. It does seem to work on the systems I've tested, yes. And also it's documented in various places.
Jeffrey.
This is Jeffrey Yaskin. I would suggest editorially adding an example or changing an example to show the white space that is optional.
Right. So in addition to explicitly allowing it, changing an example. Okay.
Yeah, fine.
Roy, that good? Yeah. Great. And Julian +1. Great, thanks, Julian. Next up, range header field A, B, and F. Very similar. Julian, I think you've been working on this one recently, haven't you?
I have.
Or was it Roy? Okay,
so
talk us through it.
There is a pull request there for a refactoring of the range header field A, B, and F to move the byte ranges specifier out of the core A, B, and F and just have a general A, B, and F for all range units, and then specify byte ranges as one case of that. There's a PR online. We probably don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I would encourage people to look at it and verify that it's okay. Once I need to fix it now to put the £1 sign back for the set, but other than that, there are no changes to the actual protocol itself.
So we'll take this as a heads up. Roy, I'll give you a review on that soon. And I like I am very far down the rabbit hole in this one to comment. 194, quicken HTTPS. It's just a general notice to the working group to review the PR. Thank you. 194, I think where we're at on this issue is we're ready to close it, but we never did formally. No?
So, so Mike asks off Mike whether we have text. From my perspective, I think we're going to need some language somewhere.
Right, and I reminded there was a lot of chatter on the issue recently that I'm not sure was terribly related, but I saw proposals to bring some or all of 2818 into core semantics. And I saw a proposal to rewrite the establishing authority section to make the implications on clients and servers clearer and to reference that from the appropriate places like the host header definition. Those seem like two separate concrete things we could do. I think the second one is probably not terribly controversial. It could be a separate issue, or we could just use this issue for it. The first one, bringing 2818 into semantics is a bigger thing. What do people feel about that?
Mike Bishop, since I'm already the mic. Honestly, I'm a little unsure why that hasn't already happened, since the definition of HTTPS is in here.
Right.
So
because the URL scheme is,
Yeah, I mean, we're already restating it. let's just go ahead and fold it in.
Roy, any pushback on that? +1 from Roy.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. Let's go ahead and take that. Let's go ahead and take that as an instruction editors to fold that in. I want to create another issue one for that one definitely because it's not a small task.
Yeah. Martin Thompson, I wanted to caution on that one. RFC 2818 is old. It is very, shall we say, loose in its description of how to do name validation and other such things. And there may be a desire on the part of the reviewers of this document to have this updated to more modern practices, such as the ones that are discussed in 6125. Thank you. I already knew that number. And so there's a hazard here. And I don't think it's a particularly bad one, but it probably means that we're biting off a little more work than just taking the text and copying it across. That's all.
So maybe it would be more prudent for us to at least to start to bring just the HTTP bits in, update 2018, and maybe someone somewhere will create a separate document to update the older bits.
You see, that to me just seems like you're trying to weasel out of doing the concrete work that needs to happen.
No, I'm just trying to get somebody else to do the concrete.
That's one on a weasel.
Isn't that what I said? So I understand that it's a little difficult. I don't think it's particularly bad. 6125 is very thoroughly specified. And I think, without going through with a fine-tooth comb, all you need to do is read that document very carefully and make sure that that matches up with practice. And so then you can just reference that for all the thorny pieces that deal with wildcards and all those other nasty bits of certificate validation.
What I'm inclined to do at this point is maybe we need to have a couple of people with enough knowledge to go away and just do how much work would it take? Hi, Ryan Sleevey, please tell us.
And Sleevey, Google. Boy, I was going to say 2818 needs to die or burn. So folding pieces into core semantics, right? The description of the scheme is fantastic, but very little of 2818 is salvageable in terms of reflecting modern reality, right? So I'm in favor of there are a few nuggets that I do think are applicable and probably should be folded into core semantics. There's a lot of other stuff like the upgrade semantics and some of this weird stuff that just needs to die and it does not reflect reality. So it's a very little bit of 2818 into core semantics would be fantastic, but everything else is going to be a boondoggle. Like trying to salvage it, I should say.
So correction, 2817 is the upgrade stuff. So we don't need to worry about it. 2818 is like 2 pages long. And it has all of the detail of a two-page RFC, which is, I guess, the problem, right?
So what is the suggestion as far as the relationship between the documents? Do you imagine that this would be obsoleting the, okay. Great.
Channeling Julian, the HTTPS URI scheme semantics are already in 7230.
Yeah, that's not dated.
All right, I think we should probably spool up a new issue to try and assess what it actually means, and then we can make decisions after we do that.
And then for the other piece, do you want to use this issue or do you want to open a new one for the authority?
Given the length of this issue, we'll probably spool up a new issue.
Okay.
Are there any other aspects to this issue, or can we, once we have those two issues, can we close it?
Assuming that the issue to rewrite establishing authority covers everything that's discussed in the thread,
Of course.
then yeah, sure.
Okay.
Channeling Roy, I think I understand what to include for the establishing authority and can probably make an attempt at obsoleting the rest of 2818. Assign it to me.
Okay. True gentlemen. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Roy. Next up, 180, clarify multiple authorization header behavior or concatenation method. There we go. So this started as a request to clarify what happens when you have more than one authorization value. It's not defined that way. And so what this, as I understand it, and I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong, but as I understand it, let me get the right one here. Yeah, 65.7 doesn't allow the use of auth param for bearer heat, so is that an example? It's trying to expand the use of authorization to not just authenticate the user agent, which is its explicit definition, but for other parties in the request chain. And so it's a change in semantics, and I think it's a change in syntax, in that when he wants to have multiple values. Personally, wearing no hats, I think that's out of scope for this work, but I wanted to come to an agreement about the disposition of this issue while we're on the room. Any comments? Julian says out of scope on issue. Roy, are you? Oh no, it's not waiting. Okay. Anyone have any thoughts about this? Do we agree to close this as out of scope? Okay. Next up, 169 Uri length. And so I noticed that in messaging we limit. So in the HTTP1 expression of HTTP, we limit the length of a URI, but we don't have any limit abstractly in the semantics document of what the minimum supported URI length should be by implementation, so that if you transit between different versions of the protocol, for example, there are no minimum supported requirements. And it seemed to me that it would be useful to do that. There's a long discussion here. I had a modified proposal at the very end based on that discussion to add to the semantics section text that says, it is recommended that all HTTP senders and recipients support at a minimum HTTP or HBS URIs with a length of 8,000 octets. Note that this implies some structures and unaware representations. For example, the request line in HTTP 1.1 will necessarily be larger in some cases.
This is Roy. Should we say all URIs in that case, not just HTTP URIs?
Oh, because the protocol can they other URI schemes? I'm not against that. All URIs conveyed by HTTP as a transport or something like that. Okay.
And because we're being specific, we mean the encoded form? Because we're being specific, we mean the encoded form?
I don't think there's a difference between the encoded form.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by that.
And what's and HTTP's abstract concept of a URI. It just takes the octets of the URI and puts them on the wire.
Right.
So
it may go through some encoding once it goes in the wire in some corner cases. But
there are cases where query parameters are taken in UTF-8 and translated into the URI, but that's a process that happens before you have a URI.
Right. It's not an IRI. It's
right.
URI.
That's right. It's not an IRI.
All right, Roberto's, so I think we're safe.
And if we say encoding, we might confuse people by thinking it's
That's
Hoffman.
what I'm concerned about. Yeah. Okay. Next up, how are we doing on time?
About 12 minutes left.
Okay. Updating stored headers. Oh, this is going to take some time.
Skip it.
This, we don't have time for this right now, but I think we need to make some progress on this one. I was looking for something we can do. Do we have the Braid folks in the room? Okay, hi. Prepare yourselves. We'll break in another 2 or 3 minutes unless we find something really meaty. Trailers. We have a proposal for this. Again, this is a fairly complex issue. We can make progress here. Anna is asking us to use the URL standard for the location header.
Is that a duplicate?
I think I made a
Is that a duplicate?
Sorry? No, there was another one that was similar, but not the same, I don't think. So the spec currently says some recipients attempt to recover from location fields that are not valid URI references. This specification does not mandate or define such processing, but does allow it for the sake of robustness. And the proposal is to replace recipients with implementations or client implementations. But beyond that, we would close this with no action. And that got a thumbs up from Julian. Does anyone think we need to do anything more than that? I think that's almost an editorial change. Do we need to do anything more than that to address this?
So once again, we're saying that browsers can deviate from this, but this is the core protocol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to dig into this any deeper, or can we close it with that? Okay. Let me just take one last look. Braid folks, why don't you come on up? That's complex. Okay, right. Yes, please. Yeah, I think the other issues we've identified are going to take more discussion and time than we have. So let's go ahead and talk about Braid for a few minutes.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Okay, so I'm Michael Tumim, and this is Seth Genel. I came to the last meeting in Prague and I talked with a lot of you about a new proposal to add synchronization to HTTP so that it becomes a state synchronization protocol instead of just a transfer protocol, so that when state changes on a client or a server, it updates all the other clients and servers automatically. So I want to give you some updates on what's happened since then. We've been growing the group of people interested in this. I met Seth on the internet. He's actually an expert in synchronization, worked on Google Wave, and he also wants to have a standard protocol. And we went together to this DWeb conference, met a lot of DWeb people who also want the same thing. And we've been building that group. Also, we wrote an internet draft to propose basic scheme, and we got some really good feedback. I want to give special thanks to Austin Wright, who gave some good feedback, and Martin Thompson, and also Eric Kinnear. And the general feedback was we were missing a lot of connections to existing HTTP standards or other standards in that proposal. And also that the proposal itself seemed really big, but once you read it, it seemed small. And we think that you were very right. And we actually, in working through the existing standards, we found a smaller way to look at it. It's more of a thin layer of glue on top of a bunch of existing pieces, which is pretty nice. And Seth wants to propose a lot of that.
Hey everyone, I've met a lot of you this week, and that's been great. So the way that I see this is that HTTP has we handle data that never changes really well. So you get data that never changes. We set a cache expiry of 99 years. We're good. For data that changes rarely, the standard way to do this is we set a cache expiry of, say, 10 minutes or 5 hours, and then the data can be polled after that amount of time by CDNs or by end clients. But for data that either changes frequently or for data that's really big that changes infrequently, we don't have a good way to be able to either send incremental updates to say, hey, let's say data that changes every second or every 5 seconds. Either clients have to poll every 5 seconds, which is inefficient. So that's no good. And for data that's really big, let's say a document that's a megabyte in size, the only way for clients to handle things like that over HTTP today is to repoll and get a new copy of the document every time the document changes. So we've been talking about this, and I think that there's a really simple addition to HTTP, which is that, so right now we have a semantic way to be able to change documents. So we can submit a patch method, which is very rarely used, but we can specify accept patch, and then you can say, here is my semantic change I would like to make to the document. The semantics on the document side are that you can imagine a document as a state machine, and we apply changes. So each patch or each operation we want RFCs for each type, and the type says, this document with this change results in this new type. The server says, here is a new E tag, and so then the client can know what the document has changed into. So that already exists. The thing we're missing is a way to read those changes. So there's no current way to be able to subscribe to a document and get a feed of all of the changes that are being made to that document. We have things like event sourcing or server-sent events and WebSockets, so this can be built today very easily. The problem is we have no standard for it, and by having no standard, it means we can't have tooling. I'd love to talk to people who are building CDNs, because one thing I would love to do is, for example, use Cloudflare or Fastly as a fan-out service. So if my cache instead subscribes to my document, then every time my document changes, I can send to the cache, because it's subscribed, the semantic very small change, and then the cache can update automatically, do fan-out to any other clients that are subscribed, or to clients that are connecting normally, they can then just request the new document. The cache then is auto-updating and auto-invalidating, which is a really nice property, without us needing to send the whole document every time it changes. And we see this already at IETF, JMAP, iCal. There's a whole bunch of different protocols that are missing this synchronization piece. They're trying to do synchronization or trying to do subscriptions on top of HTTP right now, and they're having to poll or do webhooks or various different things that all feel like awful hacks, in my opinion. So I'm planning on writing up an RFC for the next one of the, in time for Singapore for sure. Basically suggesting that we add a new subscribe method to HTTP that's going to give us a semantic list of changes. But yeah, if that's exciting to anyone else, feel free to come and talk to us, because we want more people interested in this. And there's some other things on top of that we might be able to do to be able to make that work better. But that's going to end up in the RFC, and or maybe in a working group if we end up building something like that to be able to do the extended pieces. But yeah, thank you, and thanks for listening.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to take any questions? Or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Questions. There's also a website, braid.news, which is on the screen right now.
Alan from Dell, Facebook. I'll just forward or catch you guys afterwards and point you to a draft that Wu and I have written, which is it's an extension to HTTP2 that enables a lot of this more bidirectional server-to-client messaging, and it may be something that's appropriate for you guys.
Great, thank you.
Ben Schwartz, have you defined any of these MIME patch formats for different MIME types?
I have in software that I've written. There's also JSON merge, JSON patch, which already exist as IANA documents. So we can use those for now. I'd like to add some more for example, collaborative real-time text editing, but we can move to that when we need to.
I just have this feeling that it might be more productive to start there, standardizing those formats, because there are already, as you said, pretty effective non-standard mechanisms for doing this kind of for moving that data through HTTP. And then, with the experience of a deployed system that's actually using those patch types, I think you'll be in a stronger position to ask for HTTP changes if they're necessary.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, personally, I have experience deploying systems like this, but I appreciate the comment. Thank you.
So Martin Thompson, in response to Alan there, I think you can build, like what Seth was saying here, is you can build these things using existing messaging systems. And having a better messaging system would be great. But I think what you're kind of looking for here is a little bit more of exposing the semantics of what's going on to the protocol itself.
Yeah.
So that you can build this into things like CDNs generically and whatnot. I don't think those messaging systems are quite suitable for that. This seems to me like it'd be an interesting use case potentially for something like server push. The problem with that is it's not end-to-end, and it introduces some interesting constraints on the way that you think about the problem. So I'd be interested in talking some more about the relationship between HTTP methods, end-to-end semantics, and server push. It's a tricky conversation because there's some misalignment between the various models. But I'm kind of enthusiastic about this idea that we could do something richer with the content that we have. And certainly the suggestion that you might do this with something as simple as JSON with the suite of tools that we already have for that would be quite interesting.
Yeah.
You can imagine all sorts of ways where you identify resources that are the arrows in your graph and all sorts of crazy things. But be interesting to see what sort of things you can come up with within the constraints that we have.
Yeah, thanks. I'd really appreciate talking to you later if you're up for it.
Very briefly, because we have 1 minute. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Hi, Neil Jenkins. I design most of the JMAP stuff, so come talk to me afterwards. I was going to briefly say that when we were looking at that, one of the this seems to be mainly about changes to a single document, whereas one of the big things we need to deal with was more cache invalidation to a big collection of documents where some might have changed one other thing, and that seems to be a bit of a different space. Anyway.
I continue to be interested. I want to point out a few interesting problems, one of which is when you are having to have multiple uploads to the same place. This often happens in video for live streams, and you have to be able to show that they are actually part of the same. You can't actually trust the clients to get that right. So you actually have the transactional problem in both directions, which I'm not seeing right now. Another really fun one is CAP suggests that you pick C or A, but there are actually cases where you can go back and back solve for C when you have A. But without A, you can never have C. So there's some interesting trade-offs in there that I don't think are traditional that we need to have too.
I agree. That last piece, well, actually both of those pieces, I want to leave a lot of those particular semantics to the server for now, at least in the initial version. But I agree that they're really interesting.
And just to add one personal comment from me, I'll echo a lot of the comments we heard in the queue. This is very interesting because there's a lot of effort being put right now into coming up with solutions for low-layer transports for web stuff at various layers. But as a CDN and an intermediary person, it's a lot harder for me to add value to that. If we can talk about the higher level concepts, it's easy to think about how you can scale that out and do interesting things with it. But a lot of the really interesting parts of this is how do we integrate it into HTTP? How does it interact with other extensions to HTTP and the other mechanisms in HTTP to make sure we get the most value out of it as a community? So keep it up.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right. I think we're done. Cool.
Thanks, everybody.
And design teams, we have expectations of you. That's right. Little did they know. You got those? So little did you know.